The air inside the Lubyanka building always felt cold, even in June. It was the thick, oppressive cold of stone and secrets, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. In a high-ceilinged office in the headquarters of the Second Chief Directorate, the KGB's counterintelligence arm, a heavy manila file, landed on a polished desk with a sound like a muffled slap. The general stared at the name typed on the cover. Tolkachev, Adolf G. It was not a name that inspired fear. It was the name of an engineer, a grey man, a senior designer at the Phasotron Design Bureau, the heart of Soviet avionics. He was 58 years old, married, with a son. He was, by all accounts, a model Soviet citizen. And, as the report inside the file detailed with sickening clarity, he had been a CIA spy for 6 years. The general, a man whose entire career was built on the premise of Soviet invincibility and internal security, felt a different kind of cold. This wasn't the chill of the Lubyanka. It was the icy dread of failure. The arrest itself, on June 9th, 1985, had been textbook. A quiet street, a few polite but unyielding men from the Alpha Group, a car door shutting with finality. There was no struggle. Tolkachev knew the game was over. But as the general read the preliminary interrogation summary, the dread turned to a quiet, burning fury. This was not a victory. It was the revelation of a catastrophe. For 6 years, this nothing engineer had systematically photographed and passed to the Americans the most sensitive documents related to every advanced aviation project. The radar systems for the new MiG-29, the avionics for the Su-27, the development of look-down divided by shoot-down technology. He hadn't just given them blueprints, he had given them the future. He had handed the CIA the keys to the Soviet Air Force, rendering billions of rubles of research and development utterly obsolete before the first planes had even rolled off the assembly line. The Americans didn't just know what was coming. They knew its strengths, its weaknesses, and they were already building the countermeasures. The general slammed the file shut. He looked at the 2 younger, paler officers standing at attention before his desk. "His handler," the general said. The words were quiet, dangerous. "The CIA case officer, the one who ran him. Who is it?" The 2 officers exchanged a nervous glance. The senior of the 2 cleared his throat. "General, we do not know." The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls. "You do not know?" the general repeated, his voice a disbelieving whisper. "We have just arrested the most damaging spy in the history of the Soviet Union. He has been operating for 6 years. He has met his handler, by his own admission, over 20 times, and you are telling me you do not know who it is." "We have nothing, General," the officer said, his voice straining. "We have torn his apartment apart. We have dug up the floorboards of his dacha. We found the cameras, the one-time pads, the encryption keys. We found the poison pills. But we found no trace of his case officer, no descriptions, no names, no locations." "What about surveillance?" the general roared, his composure cracking. "My God! What about the 7th Directorate? What about the Nadzor? We have 3,000 men in this city, whose only job is to watch the Americans. Every footstep, every car ride, every time a CIA officer sneezes, I am supposed to have a report on my desk." He pointed a thick finger at a map of Moscow on the wall, specifically at the cluster of streets around the American embassy on Tchaikovsky Street. "The action zone. We live there," he shouted. "We have men on foot, Filiki watching every exit. We have surveillance posts in the apartments opposite. We have listening devices in their walls. We have teams in cars, a rolling box of eyes, ready to pick up any target, any time. We follow them to the grocery, to the ballet, to the bathroom. It is the most intense, total surveillance state ever conceived by man. How can a CIA officer detach himself from this web, meet a high-level Soviet asset, exchange packages, and return to the embassy? Not once, but 20 times. And none of you see it? This was the true, terrifying mystery. The capture of Tolkachev was not the end of an operation. It was the beginning of a nightmare. It was the definitive, terrifying proof of a ghost. If you're finding this glimpse into the KGB's secret failures as fascinating as we do, our channel, Cold War Impact, is where we tear down the myths to find the truth. Subscribe to Cold War Impact and join the investigation. The KGB's Second Chief Directorate, SCD, was, on paper, the most formidable counterintelligence organization on Earth. It had unlimited resources, zero legal constraints, and the paranoia of the state behind it. Its agents were trained to see patterns in chaos, to find the hidden thread in a tangle of lies. And now, they were baffled. They put Tolkachev's life under a microscope. They reviewed 6 years of his movements. He took the bus. He went to work. He went to his dacha. He was perfectly, excruciatingly boring. Then they turned their focus on the enemy, the CIA's Moscow station. They knew who the officers were. They had their pictures, their names, their cover titles. The KGB analysts began a painstaking review. They cross-referenced every known walk or drive taken by a CIA officer for the past 6 years with the known movements of Adolf Tolkachev. They were looking for the overlap, the one brief moment, the 2 men who passed in a park, the car that slowed down on a bridge, the brush pass in a crowded metro station. They found nothing, absolutely nothing. The data showed 2 parallel universes. On one side, the CIA officers, constantly shadowed by the KGB's Nadzor teams, going about their heavily surveilled lives. On the other, Adolf Tolkachev, the ghost, moving freely. The 2 lines never, ever crossed. It was impossible. It was a statistical anomaly. It was a failure of physics. They are using a new technology, one analyst proposed in a panicked memo. A high-speed burst transmitter buried somewhere. Tolkachev retrieves the data and transmits it. There is no personal contact. Ridiculous, his superior countered. The data he passed was physical, film negatives, documents. He had to hand it to someone, look for the dead drop. So they looked. They re-swept every park, every bridge, every loose brick in Moscow that had ever been identified as a potential dead drop location. They found old cigarette packs, discarded vodka bottles, and lovers' notes. They found no spycraft. The general grew thinner. The men in the second directorate stopped sleeping. The paranoia in the Lubyanka became a living thing, a shadow in the hallways. They had a spy they couldn't find, a handler who was invisible. But the most terrifying part? The part that kept the general awake, staring at the ceiling in his dacha? Tolkachev wasn't the first. He was just the latest in a string of impossible events. For years, the KGB had been plagued by these moments. An agent, a low-level clerk, a disgruntled scientist would suddenly go dark. They would be there one day, at their desk, living their life, and the next, they would be gone. Vanished. Their apartments would be empty. Their families would have no explanation. They would not appear on any flight manifest. They would not cross any border. They had simply ceased to exist inside the Soviet Union. Days, weeks, or sometimes months later, the KGB would hear the noise. A press conference in Washington, a new, damaging book published in London, a voice on Radio Free Europe, detailing the very secrets the KGB was tasked to protect. They were exfiltrating them, rescuing them. The CIA was walking into the heart of the fortress, into the most surveilled city on Earth, and plucking the KGB's most wanted traitors from right under their noses. The Tolkachev case was a failure. Yes, the man was caught. But his 6 years of success were part of the same mystery. The vanishing agents and the invisible handlers. How were they doing it? Was it a network of safe houses? A new hidden rat line to the border? Was the American embassy itself, that fortress on Tchaikovsky Street, somehow breached? Did it have a secret tunnel? The KGB's investigation was no longer about one spy. It was about the fundamental, horrifying possibility that their entire system was a lie, that their total surveillance was a joke, that the CIA wasn't just at the gates. They were already inside, and they were running a magic show. The failure to find Tolkachev's handler was not just an embarrassment, it was an existential crisis. The KGB was an organization built on a single, terrible premise. We see everything. It was the source of its power. It was the foundation of the state itself. And now, that foundation was cracked. The general in the Lubyanka office was a symptom of a much larger disease. Across the vast, grey apparatus of Soviet counterintelligence, a frantic, disorganized hunt began. It was a hunt for a ghost, conducted by men who were terrified they might be blamed for its existence. The full weight of the 7th Directorate, the technological and surveillance behemoth, was brought to bear. This was not a subtle investigation, it was an avalanche. First, they tore themselves apart. The most logical and most terrifying conclusion was a mole. A traitor. Not a low-level clerk, but someone high up. Someone inside the 2nd or 7th Directorates. How else could a CIA officer simply vanish from total surveillance? It had to be an inside job. Someone was burning the surveillance logs. Someone was calling off the Nadzor teams at the critical moment. The internal security units, the KGB's own watchmen, descended. Men who had been comrades for decades suddenly stopped making eye contact in the hallways of the Lubyanka. Polygraph machines were humming day and night. Careers were ending. Senior officers, men who had survived Stalin, were abruptly retired to distant, freezing posts or simply disappeared into the cells of Lefortovo prison. The purge was brutal, inefficient, and, worst of all, fruitless. They found minor corruptions. They found men who were skimming state funds. They found embarrassing affairs. They did not find a single high-level CIA mole who was blinding the system. Because one did not exist. The paranoia only deepened. If it wasn't a mole, what was it? The investigators turned their suspicion on technology. They became obsessed with the idea of a technical solution. The Americans, they theorized, must have invented a new form of spycraft. It is a disguise, one analyst wrote, his report gaining alarming traction. Not a simple wig or a false mustache. We are talking about Hollywood-level prosthetics, masks so realistic they can pass a cursory inspection. They are not avoiding our surveillance. They are walking right past us, wearing a different face. This theory led to a series of humiliating incidents. KGB teams, now desperate, began detaining suspicious individuals. An elderly babushka walking her dog too close to the embassy, a Finnish businessman whose face seemed unnatural, a drunkard who bore a passing resemblance to a known CIA officer. They were all hauled in, subjected to aggressive inspections, and found to be exactly what they appeared to be. The diplomatic protests from the Finns were particularly loud. Another faction fixated on the embassy itself. That imposing yellow stucco fortress. The rat line is not metaphorical. A colonel from the first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, insisted, trying to shift blame onto his rivals in the SCD. It is a physical tunnel, from the embassy compound to a safe building, perhaps even to a metro station. This idea, however insane, had to be investigated. It was the Soviet way. If you failed to investigate the insane, you would be blamed when the insane turned out to be true. And so, in the dead of the Moscow night, repair crews began to appear. Streets around the embassy were torn up. They brought in seismic sensors, ground-penetrating radar. They drilled cores. They listened, their headphones pressed to the cold earth, for the sound of digging, for the hollow echo of a secret passage. They found sewers, water pipes, foundations laid a century before. They found nothing. The hunt was not just focused on the Tolkachev case. The analysts were now cross-referencing every unexplained event, every vanished agent from the past decade. They were looking for the pattern, and they found one. It was a pattern of nothing. They re-examined the exfiltration of Trigon. He was a senior scientific researcher with access to submarine and satellite secrets. And one Tuesday in the 1970s, he simply failed to show up for work. The Nadzor team outside his apartment building filed their report. 7, target's lights on. 7:30, target did not emerge. 8, target still inside. 9, protocol breach, team leader requests entry. They found the apartment empty. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were sealed. A pot of tea on the stove was still lukewarm. But Trigon was gone. Days later, he was giving a press conference in Washington, D.C., detailing the precise acoustic vulnerabilities of the new Victor-class submarine. The KGB investigators read the file with a new, sickening understanding. This was not a separate problem. The invisible handler who met Tolkachev, and the magic trick that spirited Trigon out of a sealed apartment. They were the same phenomenon. The CIA was operating with a freedom, an impunity, inside Moscow that was supposed to be impossible. This ghost, this invisible operation, became a legend within the KGB. It had no name, so they gave it one. They called it the Moscow Rules. It was a cynical joke. The old Moscow Rules were for the CIA. Assume you are watched. Assume you are followed. You cannot beat the surveillance. The new Moscow Rules, the KGB whispered, were for the CIA's new game. A game where they were the ones who were blind. A game where the Americans had found a way to become invisible. The wrong conclusions piled up. The theories became more desperate. It is the car, one group insisted. They became fixated on the embassy's diplomatic vehicles. They have a secret compartment, a man catcher. They drive past the asset, a panel opens, and he is pulled inside. It is the only explanation for the speed of the exfiltrations. This led to Operation Bumper. For 3 months, KGB chase cars began intentionally bumping and scraping American diplomatic vehicles in traffic, forcing them to a stop. The accidents were clumsy, obvious. The goal was to force the car to a police impound lot, where it could be stripped bare. The Americans, of course, knew the game. They protested loudly, and they never, ever let a damaged car out of their sight. They would wait for hours for their own tow truck from the embassy, creating a diplomatic standoff on a busy Moscow street, rather than let the car be taken. This only confirmed the KGB's suspicion. They are hiding something in the cars. They were. But it wasn't a secret compartment. The investigation was a catastrophe. It had yielded no suspects. It had produced no answers. It had only deepened the mystery. And in the process, the KGB had torn its own counterintelligence division to shreds. The purges, the paranoia, the wild theories. They had done the CIA's work for them. The general in the Lubyanka office was finally retired. His replacement was given a single impossible order. Solve this, find the ghost, or you will be next. The new general sat at his desk. He read the file on Tolkachev. He read the files on Trigon and the other vanished agents. He read the summaries of the failed internal purges, the tunnel hunting, the car bumping. He stared at the map of Moscow on his wall. He was not looking for a ghost. He was looking for the stage. "They are not invisible," he whispered to the empty room. "We are just looking in the wrong place." He, too, was wrong. They were looking in the exact right place. They just couldn't see what was right in front of their eyes. While the Soviets hunted ghosts in the cold, grey streets of Moscow, the real answers were being born in the humid, suburban quiet of Virginia. The Central Intelligence Agency's headquarters in Langley, and more critically, its secretive Technical Services Division, TSD, was not a place of paranoia. It was a laboratory. It was a workshop. It was, in many ways, a Hollywood special effects studio. The men and women of the TSD had read the same reports. They knew about the Nadzor. They knew about the 3,000-man surveillance net. They knew about the KGB's brute force, all-seeing eye. And they had come to a simple, brilliant conclusion. You cannot avoid an eye that sees everything. So, you must trick it. You must make it see what it expects to see, while you do the impossible right in front of it. The Soviet system was built on a foundation of control, but that control created a fatal flaw: predictability. The KGB's Nadzor teams were thorough, but they were also bureaucratic. They followed patterns. They followed rules. The Americans simply decided to write new rules. This was not a war of technology, of satellites, or stealth planes. This was a war of art, a war of psychology, illusion, and audacious, breathtaking tradecraft. The KGB's theory about Hollywood-level prosthetics was, in a strange way, absolutely correct, but it was also laughably simple. The reality was far more advanced. The TSD, led by masters of illusion like Tony Mendez, was in the identity transformation business. They didn't just give an officer a wig. They created characters. They built masks, not just for the face, but for the body. They developed a disguise-on-the-run kit. A case officer would leave the American embassy looking exactly like himself, a 35-year-old diplomat named John. The Nadzor team, in their unmarked Jigulis, would pick him up instantly. Target John is mobile, moving west on Tchaikovsky Street. The game was on. John would lead them on a predictable, boring route. He'd go to the gum department store, the Nadzor team right behind him. He would enter the store, walk through the crowds, and then he would step into a changing room, or an elevator, or simply turn a blind, unwatched corner, and in 5 seconds, John would cease to exist. He would have pulled a mask over his entire head. Not a simple rubber mask, but a next-generation, paper-thin, silicon-based prosthetic that transformed his face. He'd age 40 years, his hair would recede, his nose would change shape. But it was more than that. He'd rip off his boring diplomatic suit, which was attached with Velcro, to reveal the clothes of a Soviet laborer underneath. He'd pop inserts into his shoes to change his height and give him a limp. He'd pull a string bag full of cabbages from his briefcase. The man who emerged from that elevator, the stooped, elderly dedushka, was a completely different person. The Nadzor team outside, waiting for John to emerge, would see this old man walk right past them. They wouldn't give him a second glance. Why would they? They were looking for a 35-year-old American. Their radio call would be the one the CIA lived for. "Target is dark. We have lost the drop. He has vanished." Vanished. This was the invisible handler. This was the ghost who met Adolf Tolkachev in a desolate park. It was John, transformed into a phantom, who could move freely through Moscow, conduct his business, receive the packages of film, and then return to a different safe location, transform back into John, and be found by a different, confused Nadzor team hours later, complaining he had simply been shopping. The ingenuity was breathtaking. It was a direct psychological attack on the KGB's own methods. The Americans were using the KGB's total surveillance as a cover. And what about the exfiltrations? The vanished agents like Trigon, spirited out of a locked apartment? This was the same principle, weaponized. The KGB was looking for a tunnel. They were looking for a secret compartment in a car. They were looking for a thing. The CIA used a person. When it was time to pull an asset, a TSD specialist, a disguise master, would be sent into Moscow. This specialist, often under diplomatic cover, would arrange a visit to the asset's apartment. The Nadzor team outside would log it. Target Trigon is receiving a visitor, a woman, a cultural attaché from the French embassy. 14-3. Inside that apartment, a miracle of transformation was occurring. Trigon, the 50-year-old male scientist, was being turned into an elderly babushka. His wife, his visiting mother-in-law. The TSD specialist had brought everything: the clothes, the wig, the full-face prosthetic. An hour later, the apartment door would open. The Nadzor team would log it. 15:10. The French attaché has emerged. She is with an old woman, presumably the target's relative. Trigon, now a stooped babushka on the arm of the French attaché, would walk right past the KGB surveillance team. He would get into her diplomatic car. He would be driven to a safe house, or even directly to the embassy. He would not vanish. He would walk away. The locked room mystery? That was the final, beautiful piece of tradecraft. Before leaving, the specialist would use a simple tool to lock the door from the inside and leave the lukewarm tea on the stove. It was pure theatre. It was designed to send the KGB on a wild goose chase, to make them waste hours thinking the asset was still inside. Hours that Trigon was using to get to the border or onto a plane, under a new diplomatic identity. This was the American solution. It was human, not mechanical. It was creative, not just expensive. And the cars? The Operation Bumper that the KGB was so obsessed with? The KGB was right to be suspicious, but for the wrong reason. They were looking for a man-catcher. They were bumping into a communications hub. The CIA had hollowed out the panels, the seats, the dashboards, and filled them with the most advanced burst transmitters, recording devices, and surveillance detection gear on the planet. The cars were the secret. They were the mobile command centers that coordinated the transformations. They were the eyes that watched the Nadzor teams, mapping their blind spots, listening to their radio frequencies. The KGB was looking for a secret passage out of the embassy. The CIA had turned every one of its diplomatic vehicles into a secret embassy and was driving it, with impunity, all over Moscow. The American dominance was not just technological, it was a dominance of imagination. While the Soviets built a wall, the Americans had simply learned to act. The truth did not come from a brilliant KGB analyst. It did not come from a lucky surveillance team. As is so often the case in the world of espionage, the magic show was not solved, it was betrayed. The betrayal came from an unlikely source. A disgruntled CIA communications officer, a man posted not in Moscow, but in a quiet listening station elsewhere. He was a man with debts, a chip on his shoulder, and a price. He sold his knowledge not for ideology, but for cash. In 1980, he had walked into a Soviet embassy and offered them a sample of what he knew. And what he knew, among other things, was the name of the program. He had overheard the TSD specialists talking. He had seen the cables. He knew about the identity transformations. At first, the KGB debriefers in Moscow were skeptical. They were still hunting for tunnels. The defectors' information seemed theatrical, insulting. "Masks?" a KGB colonel asked. his voice dripping with disbelief during a debriefing in a sterile room. "You are telling us the CIA is defeating the second chief directorate with masks?" The defector, safe and growing arrogant, leaned back. "You're not listening. It's not masks like a child's Halloween costume. It's a full body, full identity transformation. It's art. They can walk in as one person and walk out as another. And your men, your thousands of men, they're trained to follow people. They're not trained to follow characters. You're looking for the diplomat. You're not looking for the old babushka he's become." This was the shock moment. It was not a sudden, loud explosion. It was a cold, creeping realization, a dawning, humiliating, furious understanding. The colonel sat back, the blood draining from his face. He was suddenly reliving a dozen "target is dark" reports. He was seeing the French attaché and the old woman. He was seeing the drunks and labourers who had shuffled past his teams, who had been dismissed as no-value civilians. They had been mocked. They had been played. The KGB, the most feared security apparatus on Earth, had been reduced to the role of a baffled, flat-footed security guard in a stage magician's act. This one betrayal, this one piece of human intelligence was the key. It unlocked everything. Armed with this terrifying new knowledge, the KGB's internal investigators reopened the ghost files. They were no longer looking for technical anomalies. They were looking for illusions. And now, they saw them. Everywhere. They reviewed the file of Trigon, the scientist who vanished from the locked apartment. The Nadzor report. 1510. The French attaché has emerged. She is with an old woman. The new general, the one who had replaced the retired one, read the line and his hand began to shake with rage. "An old woman," he hissed. "An old woman. How many of our vanished traitors have been old women?" They pulled the files. The data was sickening. In 3 other exfiltrations, an American or Allied diplomat had been noted leaving the target's vicinity accompanied by an unidentified elderly female or an unknown, poorly dressed male. They were ghosts who had been logged by the surveillance teams, but immediately dismissed. They turned to the Tolkachev case. 6 years, 20 meetings, how? They pulled the surveillance logs for every known CIA officer for those 6 years. But now, they looked at them differently. An officer, John, goes dark in the gum department store. The report says he vanished. The new instruction, pull the internal security camera footage from the gum. I don't care about John, I want to see who came out. They found the grainy, black and white footage. 14:3, John enters. 14:5, he turns a corner. 14:6, a man they had never seen before, a stooped Russian laborer, walks out of the same area and exits the store. He walks right past the 2 Nadzor agents who are frantically radioing that their target is dark. The colonel, watching the tape, slammed his fist on the table. "Find him!" he roared. "Find that laborer!" But how? He was a ghost. He was nobody. He was the invisible handler. The shock was total. The KGB realized it had been defeated by a concept. It was a humiliation far deeper than a new American plane or submarine. A plane could be shot down. A submarine could be sunk. But how do you stop? Imagination. Their response was frantic. It was desperate. And it was, ultimately, futile. First came the new orders. The old woman trick was now infamous. The new rule from the Lubyanka: there are no old women. KGB teams were ordered to stop dismissing anyone. Surveillance became aggressive, clumsy, and public. Nadzor teams began stopping and harassing actual old women. They demanded papers from elderly babushkas in parks. They followed laborers home from their factories. They created a new layer of terror and resentment in Moscow, but they found no spies. Second, they cracked down on transformation zones. They put undercover agents inside the gum, inside every department store, inside every public changing room. They shut down elevators for repairs. They created checkpoints in the middle of crowded markets. The result? The CIA's TSD simply adapted. They stopped using the gum. They started using a crowded bus, a dark alley, a quick duck-in to a public toilet. The transformation could happen in seconds. The city was the stage. The Soviet system was too rigid. It could not cope. To truly stop this tradecraft, The KGB would have to literally follow every single person in Moscow, 24 hours a day. It was an impossibility. They tried to counter with their own disguises. The KGB's technical services tried to replicate the American masks, but they were crude, they were heavy, they looked like masks. They lacked the artistry. The Soviet system, a system of imitation and brute force, could not replicate the subtle, creative, individualistic flair of the American TSD. The most telling moment came during the final interrogations of Adolf Tolkachev. The KGB, now knowing how he had been run, demanded the details. "The man," Tolkachev said, his voice flat, resigned to his fate. "The one I met, he was different. Every time." "What do you mean, different?" the interrogator pressed. "The first time, he was an old man, feeding the birds. The second time, he was a drunk, sleeping on a bench. The third time, he was a laborer, fixing a pipe. They were different people." The interrogator realized the truth. The CIA hadn't just used one disguise. They had rotated them. They had a cast of characters. And Tolkachev, their own billion-dollar spy, had never even seen the real face of his handler. The KGB had been hunting a single ghost. The CIA, they realized, had been running an entire troop of them. The American dominance was absolute, and it was a victory, this time, of pure, unadulterated tradecraft. The final verdict on this invisible war was not written in a single after-action report. It was written in the panicked, contradictory, and ultimately futile memos that circulated within the Lubyanka for the rest of the 1980s. Let us consider the killer statistic. It is not a number of missiles fired or of tanks destroyed. It is a statistic of human failure. The KGB's 7th Directorate, combined with the 2nd Chief Directorate's ground units, employed over 3,000 full-time, dedicated surveillance officers in Moscow alone. This was the Nadzor. This was the all-seeing eye. It was supplemented by thousands more part-time filiki, foot followers, informants, and technical officers. It was without question the largest and most resource-intensive surveillance operation in human history. And its success rate against the CIA's Technical Services Division? 0. For the better part of a decade, this multi-thousand-man net failed to detect, intercept, or even comprehend the identity transformation operations being run against it. Look at the case of Adolf Tolkachev. Over 6 years, he engaged in more than 20 separate in-person meetings with his CIA handlers. 20 separate times, a CIA officer vanished from the Nadzor's control, transformed his identity, met his asset, received packages of state, destroying secrets, and returned to cover without being seen. 3,000 watchers versus one magician. The magician won every single time. This was not a failure of personnel. The KGB's men were not stupid. They were dedicated, ruthless, and experienced. This was a failure of system. It was a failure of imagination. The Soviet system, the entire macro theme of its existence, was built on the principle of scale and imitation. If the Americans built a bomber, the Soviets would steal the plans and build their own bomber. If the Americans built a shuttle, the Soviets would build their shuttle. The system was designed to copy, and to do so with massive brute force expenditure. This systemic rigidity was its doom. When the KGB finally, humiliatingly, learned the truth that they were being defeated by art, by disguises, their response was perfectly, tragically Soviet. First, they purged. They tore their own counterintelligence divisions apart, blaming individuals for a systemic flaw. They ruined careers, imprisoned officers, and sowed yet more paranoia, achieving nothing. Second, they applied brute force. They began harassing all old women. They put agents in all department stores. They tried to watch everything, and in doing so, simply diluted their own effectiveness to the point of absurdity. They were like a man trying to catch a single mosquito with a fishing net. Third, and most telling, they tried to imitate. The KGB's own technical services were ordered to replicate the CIA's masks. The results were a disaster. They were heavy, crude, obvious. They looked like props from a bad play. They lacked the artistry, the subtle, psychological genius of the TSD. Why? Because the TSD was a skunkworks, a place of individual creativity, empowering artists and illusionists. The KGB's labs were a top-down bureaucracy, staffed by technicians who were terrified of failure. They could not innovate, they could only follow. This, in miniature, was the entire story of the Cold War. It was not a simple contest of economies, though the Soviet economy was hollow. It was not a simple contest of weapons, though the American technology was in the end superior. It was a contest of imagination. The CIA's Moscow Rules operation was a psychological triumph. It took the KGB's greatest strength, its total, oppressive, paranoid surveillance, and turned it into its greatest weakness. The Nadzor teams expected to see a 35-year-old American. So, the CIA showed them a 35-year-old American, right up until the moment he wasn't. The KGB's rigid, bureaucratic system could not process this. It was an anomaly, a ghost, a statistical impossibility. They were looking for a tank. The CIA sent a ballet dancer. They were digging for a tunnel. The CIA used a stage door. They were tracking a man. The CIA sent a character. The Cold War is often remembered in images of mushroom clouds and missile silos, a grim standoff between two monolithic, unthinking giants. But the real war, the one that defined the ultimate outcome, was a war of human intelligence, of artifice, and of creative audacity. The KGB was baffled by a ghost because they themselves had built the perfect stage for an illusion. They had created a system so dark, so total, and so rigid that they could no longer see the light. They had trained their eyes to see only the predictable, and in doing so, had become completely, fatally blind. In the end, the Soviet Union was not defeated by a weapon, it was defeated by an idea. And in the secret, frozen streets of Moscow, it was defeated by the artists who could make that idea invisible,